Hello, and welcome once again to another episode of Inside the World of MACK'S Headroom. Today I have some very light Sunday family-oriented entertainment. Yeah, sure. I want to talk about something that we call hands-off sex offending. And there's a couple reasons why I want to do that. I'll describe what hands-off sex offending is. But first, I want to tell you why I'm concerned about it. You know, in light of the society's concerns about these real big ticket sex abuse issues like Jeff Epstein, Jimmy Savile, Maxwell, child sexual abuse, incest, pedophilia, in the light of the nation or the world's concern about this kind of thing, I'm afraid that these hands-off sex offenses have fallen into the background. And I think that's a great concern because they're very intrusive acts. They definitely are very disarming to the victims of it. They carry a very low criminal justice response. They're considered misdemeanors, and so the people at most will go to jail maybe for a year, and that's only if they're a repeat offender. So, I just want to, as a harm reduction effort, try to help everybody realize what these other offenses are about. Just in the event that it happens to you, you might be aware of it. You might be able to prevent it. But with all this other stuff about child sex abuse, you don't really realize that there's these other ones that are really insidious. And I'm going to mention them in just a moment. Another reason is that I think that society at large, maybe because they have their hands full with this stuff, I don't know. But one of the things that's happened is that society seems to have humorized these disorders. And when I say that, I mean that, for instance, there was a show in the 1960s that was called Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. And Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In was like a very progressive comedy show for the time. And it was much like the precursor to Saturday Night Live. And they had a bunch of skits that were with two actors. And one was Artie Johnson, and the other one was Ruth Buzzy. And what they did was usually there was a park scene where there was a park bench, and usually Ruth Buzzy would be sitting on the bench, and then a man, Artie Johnson, would walk up like a dirty old man, and he'd sit down next to her, and then he'd sit too close, and she'd move away, and he'd sit closer, and she'd move away, and sit a little closer and move away, and then she'd usually take an umbrella or something, bash him over the head, he'd fall down, and everybody would laugh. And, another analogous situation was one time I was in Amsterdam, and I wasn't really in the formal red light district either. And again, everything in Amsterdam is like the red light district, so it's a little bit oxymoronic. But I wasn't in the formal red light district, and I was walking by a shop, and as I walked past, there was a very large statue of a man in a trench coat, and as you walked by, he had how would you say? He had there was an electric eye inside there, and so as you walk by, the guy would open the thing up. And his penis would, like a 9-foot penis, would shoot out, and then he would say, and then whoosh, it would close back up again. There's another example of how people think that flashing, and that's not even the right word for it. It's really sexual deviance. But the way that people would refer to it is, of course, like flashing. So I'm concerned, that society itself has sort of minimized what these disorders are. They don't carry a very high, justice system response, and they're obsessive as hell, or compulsive. Excuse me, they're as compulsive as hell. These guys, once they get started, just can't stop. So, but without any further ado, as they say, The first one is called Exhibitionism. I'm sure you all know about that. That's the flasher. However, if you really get inside what an exhibitionist's behavior and his inner mental workings are, it's a far more deviant act than just some innocent guy who can't get any and decides to, flash or something. Please, it's not that at all. It's very insidious. And it's a real power and control sort of thing, but I'll explain that more later. Then there's what you call voyeurism. And, voyeurism is a very interesting one because, again, it carries this name that is strange because people call voyeurs peeping Toms. Now, what the fuck is a peeping Tom? I'm peeping and my name is Tom? I mean, what the hell does that mean? And again, we all think, well, if we close our blinds, we'll be okay. But such is not the truth, and I'm going to explain why it really doesn't matter if your blinds are open or closed. You can be very vulnerable to a voyeur. The next one would be Frautirism. And Frautirism is like, again, what I told you about the Ruth Buzzy and Artie Johnson routine, where it's somebody who usually sits or rubs against you in some way, and it's a very sexual act. A lot of times people typify it as like riding on a bus and a guy's sitting too close to you and you get this weird feeling, but you don't really know what's going on. Well, I'll tell you what's going on. He's got a giant erection, and probably he's going to climax if you sit there long enough. But Frautirism as well has a very strange sort of thing. A lot of people just kind of minimize it. A lot of people kind of say when it's happening to them, will say, well, that can't be happening, But you get this uh-oh feeling. That was an expression we used to use when we would teach kids how to protect themselves from sexual abuse. So I say, if you get this uh-oh feeling, like tell somebody. And it's the same thing, except that it's usually happening to an adult. And, their mental processes are like, oh, this couldn't be happening, blah, blah, blah. So that's Frautirism. And then the last one is a real wild one, which is Scatalogia. And Scatalogia is basically the transmission of information in an obscene manner, a sexually obscene manner. It's the typical example people say is the guy who breathes into a phone, like that. But that is not the case whatsoever. There are many variations, which I'm going to explain. And I'm going to show you, why this is something to be aware of, just to, for harm reduction purposes. Now, again, why is this so important? Well, it's not only because of the first two things I said, but it's also very important because there's some research that was done that examined exhibitionism, Frautirism, voyeurism, and scatalogia. Okay? And what they found out basically was that a significant percentage of those people, their actual preferred means of sexual contact was actually rape. Okay? So in other words, it was kind of like these guys always want to rape, but when the opportunity isn't there, or maybe they just keep it submerged and rationalizing themselves to fight off this rape impulse, that they're doing these hands-off offenses, because they're never, I guess the frauder is making some contact physically, but otherwise it's all from a distance. And again, I am not talking about anything like cyber-related or deep web or any of that bullshit. It may exist, but I'm just talking about guys who do this kind of stuff. But the research says that if you get a client, this research was done for people like me, who had a sex offender treatment program. It was trying to help refine the diagnostic process and also be able to meet the guy's needs. Because what do you want to treat him for voyeurism for if really down deep he likes raping people? You follow? So, that's what this research said was, that these are just almost like substitution behaviors. Not always, because the hands-off offending, one of the things about it is it's very easy to justify because you're not touching anybody, right? You're not, nobody knows, or it's on the sneak or whatever. So it's very easy to get very compulsively involved in because you can keep justifying that you're not hurting anybody, but you actually are. Besides becoming like a terrible community nuisance. So with that research in mind, that people who commit hands-off offenses, one, the criminal justice system does not respond very punitively to. Two, victims are often likely to rationalize or suppress the importance of the intrusion of what's just been done to them. And three, most of them like to rape when left to their own devices. I mean, they may only, for instance, they may encapsulate their sexual deviance into a hands-off offense, but they may masturbate at home to thoughts of rape. You see what I'm saying? And I'll tell you something, I've said this before, but anytime you pair masturbation with any sort of deviant fantasy, the likelihood of increasing the urge to actually commit that act is like exponential. And it's a very simple explanation, and that is that orgasm is a very powerful form of reinforcement. Okay? It's very, very powerful. And so if you start shaping yourself to masturbate and fantasize about deviant sexuality, then chances are that's what all you're going to want. And every time you would masturbate to that theme, you're increasing the likelihood of actually acting on the offense to begin with. So if maybe they're voyeuring, say, but then going home and masturbating to a rape scene, they're getting closer to rape because they have a proclivity toward that. That's what the research says. You see, so they're not things to be made fun of. They're not things to normalize, etc. And they're not things to see as fetishes. You know, I got a big thing about what people call fetishes or not, because there's this whole thing, I'm just going to go off for a minute, but there's this whole thing about, anything between two consenting adults is okay. Bullshit. Let me tell you how many marriages I pulled out of the toilet because one person gets into a fetish, the other person tries to get into it, but doesn't really like it very much, and then the other person is way into it, and the marriage goes down the toilet. Anything between two consenting adults is a little naive. Unless you're very controlled about it. I'm not trying to put down the SMBD community. I mean, if they're really controlled about it, then fine. But a lot of people start out as amateurs, and it gets carried away. Or the big thing in a marriage is that one person will say, okay, well, I'll try that. I'll spank you. But then the other person says, no, you didn't spank me hard enough. And then the other person says, well, I don't want to spank you that hard. And then all of a sudden, all kinds of problems develop. They give in. They feel shitty about doing it, blah, 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 blah. So fetishes are in itself not to be made fun of either, and not to be rationalized as any behavior between a consenting adults is okay. That's not true. It gets carried away oftentimes. What's a role play? A role play is something that starts out pretend but becomes real, and the more real it becomes, the more your inner desires start to come out. So thank God they're safe words, but nonetheless, I'm not sure that I'm totally behind just open, capricious, deviant sexual behavior between consenting adults. But that's my soapbox. Anyhow, let me try to explain the various disorders I mentioned. First of all, exhibitionism. Let me give you the straight up about it, okay? If you think that pedophiles are predators, some of the worst sexual deviants are exhibitionists, and I'll tell you exactly why. They hunt. They don't just look for some unsuspecting person and whip it out. They hunt areas. They'll find a pretty girl walking down the street in a residential area, and they might slowly follow her. How'd you like that, to know somebody's following you so they can peep into your windows? They'll follow you and see what building you go into. Then maybe for a few days later, they'll sit in front of your house and scope out the area and try to figure out where the bedrooms are, and all the while they're masturbating in the car, right? So then they plan this out. I had one guy who was like a marathon runner, and so in the summertime, he would always make it look like he was just jogging. But he had this thing so planned out. He knew what trails he was going to run into. He knew what areas that those trails would take him to, and he also had gone by places. In this case, this guy used to like to go to bars where women would come out maybe a little drunk, and he would exhibit. But he had an escape plan, which way to run so they couldn't find him, and also he had scoped out parking lots where the women couldn't retreat. The only thing they could do was kind of run back in the bar. But the thing is when you're exhibited to, and maybe if you're a little loopy, you have a startle response, and you kind of go, like that, right? And then a lot of people tend to minimize it. And, I don't want to tell my boyfriend, he'll think I was acting weird, or, it was just nothing, or whatever. But here's the catch. The whole time, that exhibitionist has a person, like, kind of cornered, but maybe even from across the street, okay? he's not just flashing, okay? He's usually masturbating intensely and oftentimes entering into scatalogia, which would mean that, he's got like two things going, where he starts to talk very obscene conversation with the girl, like that may be 50 feet away, and she can't go anywhere. And he'll say, I don't even want to say on the air what they say, but just think if you could say the most obnoxious, weird, horrible things to somebody in a sexual way. That's the kind of shit they talk while they're doing it. And then as soon as she catches her wind and screams or does something like that, this dude had an escape plan through the forest preserves, and he knew just where to go. It's the same thing with the guy who maybe pulls up next to you at a stoplight with his top down, and he's masturbating. He's been sitting on the side waiting for the lane to open up and the red light to go so you can't go forward unless you go into traffic, and then he pulls right up alongside you and starts talking dirty talk to you and wanking it, So, and not to mention the fact that he'd probably rather rape you than he would be exhibiting if he had his way. So, that's the harmless exhibitionist that was made fun of on a TV show. Now, voyeurism. Voyeurism, to me, is one of the weirdest ones. It's incredibly compulsive. And it's not just a guy who's walking up to your windows and trying to peek through. Most often what happens with exhibitionists, although maybe it starts like in childhood, peeping in a window, that may be what starts that erotic process. I'm not saying that they don't just walk up to windows and look through cracks, but usually that's more in childhood. By the time they've matured into being a full-fledged voyeur, they do the same sort of stalking. They'll drive around a neighborhood until they see a pretty girl, and then they'll just kind of slowly follow her and watch and be ready to come back at night. And here's the catch, okay? I would say about 75% of the voyeurs I treated were the best fucking tree climbers I've ever seen in my life. You catch my drift? They would climb trees, and they'd bring like a little rape kit with them. It might have a towel, it might have lubricant, it might have a rope to pull themselves, up onto a branch where they think that they're in line with the woman who they think is in bed. And the funny part about it, there's two parts about it that are very strange. One is they tend to pick on the same victim until the external controls in the environment gets wise to them, and then it's not safe to do it anymore. And sometimes they don't give a shit anyway. They do it and they get busted. They just say, oh, well, it's only a misdemeanor. I'll just get sent to probation. No big deal. But what they're really doing is they oftentimes climb into a tree or like into like a swing set if they find it or something like that. And this is especially in kind of like affluent neighborhoods where houses are surrounded by forest and stuff. They climb up in the tree. They put the towel over the tree branch so they don't scrape their tee-tee. And they'll sit up there and masturbate using binoculars and lubricant several times, like compulsive masturbation. So there's another, I don't know if you want to call it sexual deviance, but it's a sexual problem when you're compulsively masturbating. You can't stop doing it all day long. At work, everywhere you're doing it, So they go climb up in a tree and will, set it up so it's nice and comfortable. But I know guys that have done it in the winter too, just dressed in extra special gear. And they'll look into this window from a distance. But here's the two unique things about it. One, every voyeur I've ever met believes that a woman who goes into her bedroom is masturbating. So it doesn't matter what you're doing. You could be reading a book or the Bible or watching TV. If he notices and he's scoped it out and he's seen, let's say, silhouettes walking into the bedroom at a certain time, then he's going to be there. And he doesn't have to look in the window. He just imagines it while he sees, say, just silhouette movement or something like that. Some voyeurs, I had one in particular who was an exercise instructor, a weightlifting guy. He was so buff. And he was so jailed by voyeurism that he'd do the tree thing. But with him, he'd start challenging himself. It was almost a little bit like Russ McCammy's thing. Like, how far can I push myself? So he'd say, like, well, maybe I can find a tree that's a little bit closer. Maybe, I bet. Oh, and then they start to get cognitive distortions. Like, I think she really wants me to come in. I mean, look at the way she was moving back and forth in front of the window. She must know that I'm out here. And this particular guy I'm talking about actually worked it to the point where he just walked in because people in nice neighborhoods don't lock their doors. That's real smart. I always laugh at that one. But he just opened up a screen door on a big patio, snuck in the house, and this is like at 3 o'clock in the morning, and eventually worked his way to where he was laying beneath the sleeping woman and masturbating. Now, thank God he never raped her, but that just goes to show you that this is not just some innocent guy who can't get any, and he's just looking in windows. It may have started like that as a kid. That's often something that happens. But so do mass murderers start out voyeuring. I think BTK was one of the original ones who reported doing a lot of window peeping as a child, and then he sexualized a bunch of things, I think. But anyway, that's Oh, and another thing about voyeurism that's really fascinating is that they begin to develop in their own head a relationship with the victim, even though the victim doesn't know it. So, in other words, they begin to think of it's like their girlfriend, and they can't wait to go home and see her, but she doesn't even know they're out there, or maybe she does. I don't know, but because a lot of times, with a lot of voyeurs, a lot of voyeurs get reported, because all a woman has to do is see somebody in her trees, and she usually calls the cops. But that doesn't mean they won't return after they've been arrested. All right, and the next one is Frautirism. Frautirism is, like I said, this guy who rubs against you when you don't know what's happening. But the catch with Frautirism is just that what they're fantasizing doing to you while their leg is against you is really pretty ugly. And they're known to climax while this is going on, and you might not even know it. You just might know them shifting around a little bit. Just to show how far this weird orgasm thing is, my dad was a criminal attorney. And he had a client who was a cat burglar. And he one time told me that the cat burglar used to orgasm every time he'd go through the window with a TV in his arms. I mean, that just goes to show you how people can sexualize certain invasions on other people's privacy. But these, the frauders, are just, they're thinking really evil thoughts. They're oftentimes reaching an orgasmic state while you either do know about it, or you probably wouldn't know what's happening, but you know something weird's happening. And they're a terrible nuisance. If I had more time, I'd tell you a personal experience that happened with me and my wife and another couple with a frauder, but maybe in another tape. And the last one is scatalogia. And scatalogia is basically the inappropriate sexualized verbal or written communication acted from one person onto another. It's typified by the obscene phone caller. Okay? The obscene phone caller would be, an example, but here again, let me tell you, I'm going to tell you a story about a guy I treated, and it'll show you that it ain't just some dude who can't get anything and he's breathing in the phone. No. This particular guy was the head of a landscaping thing for a park district. And interestingly, he was sending obscene phone calls and obscene letters to all of his wife's girlfriends. That says something about the marriage, huh? And it escalated to where first it was phone calls, then it was letters. Then he started delivering the letters in the middle of the night inside the door. And then that finally, it's a little humorous. It culminated with him ejaculating into a condom, taking the condom, putting it in her door, and of course there's DNA. So he got in some trouble. But interestingly enough, the guy never went to jail for doing something so obscene. Never went to jail ever. And he was really funny, too, because he was the kind of guy who was like, mea culpa, mea culpa, oh, I've ruined my family, oh, God, I'm so sorry, yeah. Bullshit. He got busted again, okay, because as soon as his short probation term was over, of course, he flew out of therapy and never finished. So I hope I've just sort of educated you a little bit about these other type of sex offenses. I guess just for promoting public awareness and realizing how demented and how intrusive these fellows are. I mean, I think the exhibitionists, they're all bad, really. I mean, they're really bad. And they're doing it to you thinking you don't know it. And the problem is that since it's been so normalized in society, like it's made a joke of or something, then you feel kind of stupid saying something about it. You know, and so they don't get reported as often. But yet, I'm telling you, a third of my practice was all hands-off offenders. And that, coupled by the fact that the judicial system doesn't do much except like a slap on the hand, doesn't help much. And so there you have it, Hands-Off Sex Offending by MACK'S HEADROOM. I hope it's been informative. I hope that this is a harm reduction effort. I mean, I think some of the things to help yourself not be hands-off offended are sort of simple, but maybe they're important just to keep in your head. Like one is keep your periphery aware, so that if you see a guy following you, you know, you don't just say, "Oh, good, I'm glad I got into my house." You know, no. You know, watch where he's going. That sort of thing. Lock your doors. I mean, I spent 30 years in the city of Chicago, the north side. So it was a pretty second nature thing for me to lock my fucking doors, okay? But it astounds me the amount of people who don't lock their doors and kind of brag about it. Like, oh, our community is so safe that, you know, I don't have to lock my door. Oh, no. Bullshit. You know, sexual deviance is in every community possible. So I would really advise you to lock your doors. And also, I would advise you that, you know, as soon as something like this happens, if you get exhibited to and you feel cornered, scream. Just scream. Believe me, the exhibitionist is not so into power and control that he loves the fact that you're screaming. He's a chicken shit. That's why he's doing it from like across the street. And the first peep out of you, you know, the police will be there and they'll be searching the area before you can get home. Okay? Same thing with voyeurism. If you get a creepy feeling like someone's looking in your window or someone's in your tree or something like that, don't just say, "Oh, that couldn't happen in Lake Forest." Oh, no, God forbid. One of the worst child sex offenders I ever had was a resident of the, how would you say, the ruling class of Lake Forest. You know, Lake Forest is the community where like the Walgreens come from and Oscar Myers and all these, you know, real old wealth families. He was the worst sex offender I ever treated, to be honest with you. Now, he was not a hands-off offender, but I'm just trying to say that this kind of shit exists in the richest of the rich communities. And so don't say to yourself, "Oh, I live in such a nice place, this couldn't be happening." Or he's just such a kook, or, "Oh, it's just another one of those exhibitionists." That's probably not going to happen because the exhibitionists get pretty aggressive. They just don't touch you. So that's about it. I hope this has been informative. I'm really not trying to make it entertaining, but I am trying to let you know that these kind of like watered down interpretations of these hands-off sex offenses are just not what they are. Believe me. And it's all based on this notion called cognitive distortions. It's the way that the offender thinks, you know, and how he talks himself into the fact, or how he plans to make these hands-off sex offenses occur. They are the most predatory. Maybe not the frauteur, but definitely the exhibitionist, the voyeur, and the scatalogist are very planful, very, very planful. And they're truly predators. It's just that they get a misdemeanor charge, and society's watered down the impact of the whole thing. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight, and thank you for being with me. And this has been another episode of Inside the World of MACK'S HEADROOM. Thank you very much. Good night. Ah, fuck.